I'd like to welcome to the 2026 edition of the Air Transport Symposium. Really pleased to have all of you here today. As you know, last year was a landmark year regarding the aviation for all. Then this declaration that was signed a couple of years ago managed to attract more companies, and then in total we're around 60 organizations and companies. Then I'd like to thank also the ACI group and all the ACI group in the sense that all the region and the ACI world pay with RAA, that and you know also the other organization and companies like Civil Aviation of Greece, Istanbul Airport, Athens Airport, Embros, and so on. Therefore, the theme is about the next steps, because we signed the declaration, we had more companies, and also in the last assembly we were supported by 12 states, this declaration. Then it was a really big success, and then our job regarding with the governments and the authorities was really well done. Then we need to see what the next phase. Then this is the theme of today's discussion. This event will not be possible without the support of our sponsor, with Embros, Frequentis, and the Transport Consulting. I would like to thank them. And without further ado, I would like to invite Christos Tsitouras, the Governor of Civil Aviation of Greece, very good friend, and we met in a previous edition 4 years ago here, first time, and he's loyal and participates.
Here we are again. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, dear colleagues and friends, it's a great pleasure on behalf of the Hellenic Civil Aviation Authority to welcome you to today's 2026 Air Transport Symposium and to this timely discussion on additional forward next steps. A special word of appreciation also to Dr. Kostas, our host today. Kostas, the ability not settle for a perfect time, to create the right setting for the right people, to have the right conversation at the right time, which means in general passepartout. Let me also extend a particularly warm welcome to Olivier Jankovec. Olivier is one of those rare voices in European aviation who combine strategic depth and clarity, realism and consistency. For many years, he has helped shape the conversation of the future of airports and air transport in Europe with insight, credibility, and a strong sense of purpose. Olivier, it is a real honor to have you with us today, and we are truly delighted to welcome you to Greece once more. We very much look forward to your keynote address. Allow me also from this podium to extend my sincere congratulations and best wishes to Mr. George Kalimasias, who, as you know, was recently assumed the position of CEO of the Athens International Airport. At a time when developments in our wider region remind us how fragile stability can be, we all have the responsibility to pursue what we have inherited: peace, dialogue, connectivity, and the institutional cooperation the previous generations worked hard to build, especially in moments of uncertainty. Responsibility and mutual respect are not signs of weakness, they are signs of maturity and leadership. Aviation moves forward through continuity, trust, and cooperation. And that is exactly why gatherings like today's matter so much. They bring together institutions, industry leaders, and decision makers who share a common responsibility for the future of our sector. I'm confident that today's discussions will be both insightful and constructive, and that they will help us move one step further towards a more connected, resilient, and forward-looking aviation sector. Thank you very much, and wish you all a productive and inspiring symposium. Thank you.
Julien officially was saying to me about the passport. Now it's recorded, and I'm known as the passport of the air transport. Thank you, Christos, for the kind words. Then it's my real pleasure and honor to welcome a very good friend. We know each other for 20 years. Actually, I was in his election in HCAA Europe back in 2006. In June, actually, you celebrated in June the 20th anniversary. I was leading HCAA Europe. Then, Olivier, you have the floor to do the presentation.
Thank you, Kostas. Good afternoon to all. Christos, Kostas, thank you very much for inviting me. I think many of you here know that I have a soft spot, more than a soft spot, for Greece. So it's always a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Kostas, for bringing the industry together in a different forum. I think in the times we live, I think staying together and bringing the industry together is going to be more important than ever. I'd like to give you a bit of an overview where we stand today as Europe's airports, and especially looking also beyond today at what challenges we see for the times ahead, our complicated times ahead, and how Europe's airports are going about addressing those challenges. So starting with, of course, traffic. Last year was a very good year. 2.6 billion passengers welcomed by Europe's airports. That was 200 million more than the previous year. You can see the figures here. They were growing nicely, well ahead of where we were pre-COVID in 2019. And if you look at the details, maybe for some of you it's a bit difficult to see, but the different national markets were all growing very nicely, positively, both within the EU plus area and beyond the EU plus area across the wider European continent. But I think all in all, behind this performance, the reality is that we still have a lot of airports that have not yet recovered their pre-pandemic traffic volumes. And clearly we are in a different reality post-COVID in terms of our airport market, in the sense that it's a much more fragmented market in terms of performance. And indeed, if you look at last year, but compared to 2019, you can see huge differences in performance amongst European markets. Especially some markets which remain significantly below their pre-pandemic levels, including Germany, the Nordics, or even France. Conversely, other markets that are outperforming within the EU, markets especially to the south and the east of Europe, reflecting the fact that the recovery was largely leisure-driven in Europe. And of course, on the non-EU plus market, also very dynamic markets in Central Asia or countries like Albania, but also, of course, countries hit by geopolitical events like Israel. Where are we this year? We have traffic data up to January, and January was a good start. As you can see, we continue to see passenger traffic growing, freight is doing extremely well. And again, you can see very good performance across the European spectrum. I think the traffic growth dynamic is moving slightly from southern countries to eastern countries, and that's part of the normalization, because the propensity to fly in eastern countries is still lower than in the rest of Europe. We have supply pressures, of course. Airlines are having a very hard time in terms of securing the aircraft, or they're having maintenance problems. So that kind of constrains the capacity they can put in the market. But still, this is capacity for this summer compared to last year. You can see it's still growing nicely. What we're seeing and continue to see is significant pricing power from airlines. This is the evolution of airfares on a monthly basis compared to 2019. We can see that on average airfares have been growing above inflation, although we can see that it's softening a little bit for later this year. And we have, of course, operational criticalities in terms of ATM performance and capacity in Europe, which continues to be a headache. We have huge issues with border control at many European airports, and of course we are in the middle of the rollout of the new Schengen entry-exit system, which is creating a lot of disruptions, and we're quite worried about how this is going to play out for the summer. And finally, we can see that we have also increasing disruptions coming from climate change that is impacting Europe's airports. So that's a bit how we saw things in January and February, but of course now we're in a different reality since the last 2 weeks with the war in the Middle East. and the outlook is much more uncertain. I think it's very difficult to say where this is going. What we know is that for now we have both a supply and demand shock as a result of the war. Traffic to the Middle East is quite significant for Europe's airports. On average, 11% of the capacity of Europe's airports goes to that region. Michael Leary has been quick to say, well, that's not such a problem because people will trade down and they will travel more within Europe rather than externally. That might be true to some extent, but you just can't substitute demand to the Middle East like this. What is interesting to see is the aeropolitical repercussions of that conflict at the moment, based on statements from Lufthansa warning that the dependence of Europe on connectivity offered by the Gulf hubs is Europe's Achilles heel. And of course, Lufthansa is being very quick again in trying to get the EU aviation agreement with Qatar being renegotiated or even cancelled. That's obviously something we do not support as airports because we want to make sure that open skies remains the reality and is not being questioned. Impact on capacity and airfares, I think that's clear. We're seeing that. Jet fuel prices have been going up the roof, and especially in Europe because I think about 40% of jet fuel in Europe comes from the Middle East. So the situation with the Strait of Hormuz is indeed a big worry. And on average, jet fuel is up 70 to 80% compared to where it was last month. So clearly that's going to impact potentially demand as we're going to see airfares or additional fuel surcharges being put in place by airlines. And beyond that, we have the worries about what this crisis means for the global economy and the European economy. There are renewed fears about inflationary pressures, which will just add to the cost of living crisis we've been seeing. So I think that adds to the uncertainty. Looking at our forecast, that was our pre-war forecast for the coming years. The core scenario is this line. So we were anticipating that passenger traffic growth would moderate in the coming years, going back to more normalized historical trends. Of course, this is now up in the air. It's very difficult to make any forecast at the moment. Moving to our market, our aviation market, I think clearly what we see is that post-COVID we are in a totally different environment. On the demand side is the primacy of leisure VFR and leisure demand. And that's been the main driver of the resilience and the growth in air traffic. That reflects the fact that people are moving from material consumption to experiential consumptions. And that in Europe also reflects generational inequality, in the sense that the younger generation, the Generation Z, can't really get onto the property ladder. They can't access to home ownership, which means they have more disposable income, which they are spending on experience and on traveling. So that's very good for us. And at the same time, we have the older generation, the baby boomers, who are very healthy, who have quite accumulated some money, very affluent, and they're also like to spend on travel. So it's a bit counterintuitive, but actually, generational inequality is a big part of the story of the resilience and the growth in air traffic in Europe over the past years. We're seeing also demand being much more premium, which is also driving airports to look differently at the way in which they develop their facilities and their services. And also another structural change is that demand has become much more international than domestic. This is the level of international versus domestic traffic last year compared to 2019, and what you can see here is a very significant slump in domestic traffic in the biggest European market. France minus 27%, Germany minus 48% in passenger traffic on domestic routes. But even interestingly also in the north of Europe or even in Eastern Europe, Poland and Romania are countries where domestic traffic is structurally lower than what it was pre-COVID. The good news is that we still have a lot of pockets of growth in terms of future demand in Europe, because in many countries the propensity to fly is still much lower than the European average. So that means we're going to see, especially to the east of our continent, we're going to see more growth coming, more demand expanding for air transport. And that's going to also be the case because of the prospect for further enlargement of the European Union. If we look at what has happened with past enlargement waves, each time we saw a big jump in air connectivity in demand for air transport as the markets got more integrated. So moving now from the demand to the supply side. On the supply side, I think what we're seeing is the rise of ultra-low-cost carriers and Turkish airlines, not just Turkish Airlines, but also Pegasus, of course. This is the seat capacity this winter compared to pre-pandemic from selected airlines, and you can see that airlines like Ryanair, Wizz Air, Pegasus, Turkish Airlines have really taken profit of the post-COVID reality to increase their market presence. And conversely, our traditional network carriers, IAG, Lufthansa, Air France, KLM, are still below where they were in terms of seat capacity in the market, or marginally above. So that's also a new reality. What we think is going to be is that we're going to see more of that in the coming years, because especially Ryanair and Wizz Air have very ambitious plans in terms of growing their fleet. They're engaging, and that's part of keeping their unit costs lower. They're also densifying their network to maximize their revenues, and all this, of course, is about protecting their competitive edge, and it's also about stimulating demand, which as airports, of course, we like very much. Same dynamics at play for Turkish Airlines. This has really become a global airline with, again, very ambitious plans for future growth in terms of how their fleet is going to expand. However, I think in the past week we've seen an interesting statement from their chairman saying that they are likely to focus more on what he calls disciplined growth, rather than just grabbing market share at all costs. So that's also potentially a signal which I think in the current environment with the Middle East war is going to probably be reinforced. Meanwhile, if we look at our Western full-service carriers, they are also very successful, but that's following a different strategy, not by looking at increasing market share, but by going up market and becoming much more focused on their hub. They are also consolidating, and when they are growing mainly through their low-cost offspring. All these developments means that we've seen airlines in Europe going back to renewed profitability levels, in some cases even unprecedented profitability levels. We've seen that with the recent announcements of the financial results of a number of airlines over the past weeks. But behind that, I think there's a big question mark about the future, because in Europe, those airlines are operating in an environment where our regulatory costs and policy costs are becoming higher and higher. This is the cost of passenger right regulations, ATM inefficiencies, lots of national aviation taxes, and decarbonization-related costs, with the cost of the EU emission trading scheme and the SAF mandates. Our colleagues at A4E estimate that those costs are going to continue to grow and will bring a significant competitive disadvantage for European airlines. They estimate that those costs will grow to 19.1 billion of extra cost by 2030. And of course, this is not something we are very pleased about as airports, not least because this means that we're going to see even more pressure from airlines when it comes to airport cost. I think clearly we're in a new reality where airport competition is now playing out at the network level in Europe. And this is the case with Ryanair, of course, but even from Lufthansa. This is actually a quote from, I think, from Carsten Spohr, who's very clear about the fact that now Lufthansa, given its size, given its multi-hub strategy, is able to play out the competition between airports and decide to allocate their resources based on what the best offers they get. So we've looked at demand and supply. Let's try now to go a little bit at the macro level, because I think we all realize we live in a completely different reality today, where not just for aviation, but for many businesses, we see much more risk and challenges. And of course, for us, it's the risk of multi-disruptions coming from the convergence between geopolitical, cyber, and physical threats. And again, what we've seen about the last 2 weeks is just, the perfect illustration of that. It's about climate change that is going to impact more and more our business in terms of modifying travel demand patterns and where people want to go. impacting more and more our airport operations and infrastructure. We've seen many airports in Europe dealing with extreme climate events, notably floodings about the past 2 years. And down the line, I think we're going to see climate change impacting societies at large and really potentially disrupting wealth creation. And in doing that, of course, that means that potentially there are negative impacts in terms of demand for air transport in the future. Also, what we're seeing in terms of disruptions and risk is increasing volatility and slower growth of air traffic in Europe compared to what we've been used to. Again, that's the impact of EU climate policies, which we know are necessary, but which are going to be super costly for the European aviation sector. Through Destination 2050, with our airline partners, we came to the conclusion that the cost for European aviation to achieving net zero by 2050 is 1.3 trillion. And it's clear that no sector can shoulder those costs alone. What this will mean is that those costs will be translated into higher fares and lower demand, and indeed, compared to the initial estimates of 2% of annual growth in passenger traffic by 2050, we're now closer to 1.4%. So still growth, but much lower than what we had anticipated. At the same time, in Europe, we have a very difficult situation in terms of the lack of airport capacity. Europe is home to half of the world's most congested airports, and we all know that it's much more difficult in Europe than in any other continent to develop physical capacity. And Eurocontrol tells us that by 2050, actually 1.1 million flights in Europe will not be accommodated because of a lack of airport capacity. And all that is coming as we're facing fierce global competition in terms of aviation positioning and the risk of the EU market being bypassed. Of course, it used to be, and it will, I think, continue to be, despite the events today, about the Gulf, but we're seeing newcomers, we're seeing more countries really investing and putting aviation at the core of their economic development policy. Ethiopia, India, of course, but also Morocco, Egypt, very ambitious plans to develop the aviation sector. So when you look at all that, the changes in the market and this new, much more risky and uncertain environment, I think that for us as airport, it's clear that our agenda is about resilience and future-proofing, and that we need to rethink our fundamentals and address a number of key challenges, and I will finish on those challenges. The first one is, of course, earning not just our license to grow, but our license to operate. We cannot compromise on decarbonization. We need to chart a way forward, but of course, we need to find ways to do this, to decarbonize while safeguarding air connectivity and the amazing economic and social benefits it provides. And we're not yet there in terms of our policy environment on this chapter. The second challenge is decoupling our financial viability from volume growth. I think as airports, our business model historically is based on the assurance of dynamic volume growth in terms of traffic. And as I've shown, I think there's a lot of question mark about the pace of growth for the future. We know that we are going to face structural downward pressures. We've worked with BCG on this, and it's quite clear. These are slides from a presentation, from a study we released last January. And at the same time, we're going to face structural upward cost pressures because airports are very capital intensive and cost intensive, and we are evolving in an inflationary environment. So out of this, of course, the question is how we're going to be able to keep investing in modernizing our facilities, in digitalization, innovation, cyber security, ESG. I think what we're facing potentially, based on our analysis, is 360 billion investment needs, euro in investment needs from Europe's airports by 2040. And it's not going to be easy to manage and deliver on those investments in a situation where we're facing potentially lower revenues and increased cost. And for us, that means that the way forward is going to be about increasing our unit revenues, which potentially means increasing what we charge to airlines to use our facilities. And you know that these are not going to be very easy conversations. But again, the report we delivered in January with BCG shows that this is the only way forward for us to be able to keep investing and deliver on our societal goal. The third challenge is what we call becoming the masters of our own capacity, because when you run an airport, basically it's a bit like running a factory that you've invested in, but the throughput of which is determined by third parties which you do not really control. And indeed, we need airports to be much more in control of the way their stakeholders, in particular airlines, are using their facilities, because down the line it's about efficiency in terms of cost and investment, but also in terms of connectivity and environmental performance. And finally, all these challenges are linked to policies and regulations in Europe. And this is core to our mission as HCAA Europe, of course, to continue to stand for our members, for the industry, to make sure that policymakers really understand what we're dealing with, the new kind of challenges we're facing, and that they can deliver for us more supportive regulations and policies. Down the line, those challenges are part of our transformation agenda as the airport industry, as our businesses. It's about moving towards an evolved and new value creation model for airports. And down the line, that's going to be based on three key pillars: sustainability, innovation, and diversification. This is about taking the airport business model in Europe to the next stage, ensuring that as businesses we can also deliver for the competitiveness and the cohesion of our continent, and of course that we provide value for all our stakeholders and the planet. And that, I think, sums up a bit the agenda and the priorities we're following as HCAA Europe together with our airport members. And this is something, of course, we are firmly committed to deliver for and with our members always. Thank you very much.